I'm very, very proud to be part of what has been aptly called over the weekend by several members of the committee, the resurrection of Liam O'Flaherty, and long may it continue. And I think this is, for all of us, we're all hoping this is part of the beginning of something much bigger for O'Flaherty, because O'Flaherty is certainly, for me, arguably, you know, and I love a good argument about these things, and I hope we'll have a row after I talk, and the floor will be open for that row to anybody who wants to come in. I think it's very important that we do argue about O'Flaherty, because we're not learning about him unless we're arguing about him, and we're not doing him any justice unless we're arguing about him. Now, O'Flaherty is a great writer. In my opinion, he's a greater writer than, for example, Samuel Beckett. Okay, that's not a generally held opinion, because Beckett is taught in universities generally by middle-class people who are not interested in the type of thing that O'Flaherty wrote about, or the consequences of the thought of O'Flaherty. O'Flaherty, for me, is a challenger to Joyce for the great writer of the Irish 20th century. What is a great writer? And I'm kind of heading off a question I anticipate, or an objection I anticipate, when I'm going into detail about what I think is in the book, by saying that a great writer is a writer who is not aware, is not conscious of the complete meaning, or maybe even 10% of the meaning of the things that they write themselves. Okay? Shakespeare did not have any idea, right, that for the next 500 years there would be tens of thousands of people employed in digging out the meaning of Hamlet. Okay? That's a fact, right? Shakespeare was just putting on a play because he needed to make money to pay his bills, ultimately. Okay? He did, and he wrote Hamlet in a few weeks. Okay? And the same can be said of a lot of great books. Don Quixote by Cervantes, probably the greatest novel in the history of the world. I mean, that's again something that people argue about continuously. Cervantes himself documented in all of his letters simply telling a story. Okay? So a great writer is what a Pound called Ezra Pound, who was a fascist, by the way, but a great writer, okay? So not necessarily contradictory, unfortunately, okay? A great writer is what Pound called the antennae of the race. The antennae of the race, okay? The antennae of the race, in the sense that that writer absorbs absorbs the great movements and the great currents and the great happenings and the great events and the great ideas and the great motion of their time. In particular, motion, a very important word to O'Flaherty, who believed in the beauty of motion above all things, absorbs those ideas and reproduces them in a form which, if you like, is digestible to the widest number of people as possible. I do think that accessibility, and Flaherty is a very accessible writer, he's a great storyteller. I think accessibility is a mark of a great writer. I think obscurity is not the mark of a great writer. Again, that's a mistake that's often made in middle-class universities. Okay, a great writer also writes what Ezra Pound again called, great man for the soundbites, news that stays news. News that stays news, okay? And what that means, as you work it out, is that as time passes and generations come along, every generation will find new levels of meaning in a great writer's work, okay? Some writers are great period writers, okay? We've many great period writers. Now, William Carton, for example, was a great period writer. There's not much left to be discovered by William Carton, to be honest with you. It's all been done 10 years after he was dead. He was finished with, okay? O'Flaherty's a different matter, okay? So O'Flaherty, being a writer of the caliber of great, is almost inexhaustible. Okay, there's a prophetic quality to O'Flaherty's writing, because O'Flaherty was so in tune with what was happening in the world. Okay, he was so in tune with what was happening in the world that he's still relevant to what is happening today. Okay, and there are some parallels between our own period and his period. Now, what kind of novel is Skerrett? Okay, again, a great sign of great writers. There's an argument about this. Some critics will say it's a romantic realist novel. Okay, some people will say it's a nihilist novel. A novel that rejects human life, that rejects meaning in human life, and so on. And others will argue that it's a melodramatic novel. It's a novel of melodrama. Okay, in other words, it's a soap opera or an opera. Okay, and it has operatic qualities. I could see Skerrett on an opera stage. Actually, if somebody took time to do a libretto for it, I think it would be beautiful. And I also think that there's romance in the novel, romantic in the sense of Shelley. I mean, political romantic, and I do think there's nihilism in the novel, undoubtedly, and it comes very, very close to being a nihilistic novel, and I'll go into the reason why that happened in O'Flaherty's life in a second. But I believe that it is fundamentally not all of it's all of those things, but more than those things, it is an allegorical novel. Okay, what is allegory? Allegory is very simply a story that on the face of it is just of local significance, okay, but in fact is of much greater kind of global significance than that, okay. We're all familiar with allegory in its miniature form of parable, okay. When we've all have some experience of the Bible, I presume, we've all read or heard or whatever, and the Bible is full of parables. And allegory is used by intellectuals all down through the centuries to condense as much into the smallest possible space as they can, okay? And to take the raw data of the world, which is overwhelming. I mean, one of the things that we can say about the world now and 100 years ago is that it is overwhelmingly complex, okay? And one of the things that a writer like O'Flaherty does is he takes that raw data and he cooks it down, and he cooks it down, and he cooks it down, and he takes out the essence of it, and he serves it up in a digestible, accessible form, okay? The allegory that stands behind for me, this story of Skerrett, okay, which Seosamh has gone into, is a story of a battle between two autocrats for the soul and the body of the local peasantry and the local people, if we boil it down like that. The allegory that it is an echo of is the King Solomon story in the Bible, which we all know. The King Solomon story in the Bible is an argument between two women who owns the baby. King Solomon says, "Grand, I'll chop the baby in half," so, right? It is an allegory of that, because what that allegory means, and what the good priest would use it to explain, is that competition between human beings for control and ownership of other human beings, human life, is catastrophic for human life. Okay? And I think that, that is the fundamental anti-capitalist message of King Solomon, if you like. Okay? And in the Skerrett, again, we see this battle between the priest and the schoolmaster for who is in charge of the peasants. Okay? Who is the boss? That's what they're arguing over. Okay? And I don't think in the end any of them are sympathetic characters, and they're not meant to be sympathetic characters. Okay? That's where I would disagree with the romance. Skerrett is not a romantic character, and Father Mauclair is not a romantic character. They're not romantic in any sense at the end of the novel, at least. King Solomon, and also another reason why Skerrett is a great book, it's not simply an allegory of one thing. It's an allegory, it's a multiply layered allegory, okay? It is also, and this is where I think I might get a little bit contentious for some people around the room, it is also an allegorical critique of third period communism and socialism in one country, okay? The post-1928 turn in the Communist International towards the belief that you could build socialism in one country and that the peasantry could be made into a revolutionary class is being critiqued allegorically by O'Flaherty in Skerrett 1 year after he went to Russia, okay, and discovered more or less presciently, very presciently, he's an enormously prescient person, okay, an enormously in tune person to what is happening, because O'Flaherty's critique on a literal level is that it's not paradise, and it's not going to be paradise. It's simply an argument between various forms of autocracy over who is going to control the resources of the country. Okay? Aran Island stands allegorically as isolated Russia, okay, in the book. Okay, the peasantry who they fight over stand as the massive Russian peasantry, which at the time all kinds of different methods were being used to win to one form of communism in factional battles within the Soviet Union between Stalin, Zinoviev, Trotsky, and so on. Factional battles which were not won at that stage, which were still in process. Okay, and that comes up through all the novel because there's lots of different techniques used by both people to turn the peasants, the local people, into something that they're just not made to be. Okay, into a revolutionary class, okay, into a collective class. So, the allegory also stands, and particularly the figure of Skerrett, who's a wonderful character, okay. Now, I come back to this critique that is sometimes made, and it's made by Sheeran actually in this book, which, if you haven't got it, you should get it. It's an absolutely fabulous book. It's the best introduction you can get to, probably only damn introduction you can get to O'Flaherty's book, really. Patrick Sheeran, who some people in the room will remember, I presume. Wonderful, wonderful writer, wonderful critic, very accessible book. It'll set you up for a lifetime of enjoyment of O'Flaherty's books, this one. I recommend it, okay? I think he's a bit hard on O'Flaherty myself. You know, I think he's probably a better writer. O'Flaherty's a better writer, I think, in the long run than Sheeran gives him credit for, okay? Most of the time, but it's still a great book. Okay. So, what happened in Europe between the birth of O'Flaherty in the 1890s and the journey of O'Flaherty to Russia in 1931 and the production of Skerrett in 1932, almost simultaneous with one of O'Flaherty's famous nervous breakdowns, also happening in 32, 33, okay? So very, very critical time in his own personal life as well. All of this feeding into the book. What happened in Europe in that time was the collapse of European civilization, okay? And the collapse of the myths which sustained the ideology of European civilization all across the different types of myths, and they're all present in Skerrett. Okay, we can call them, generally speaking, positivism. Okay, positivism is the belief that history is going somewhere good. Okay, that there is progress written into history. Okay, that at the end of the day, if you're a Christian positivist, you believe that Jesus is going to come down and save us all, and there's going to be apocalypse and everything's going to be sound. Okay, various versions of that within Christianity, but that's the essential core of Christianity, is that we're all going to be okay in the end. Okay, if you are a liberal capitalist, okay, who the Father Mauclair represents to a certain extent in the book, okay, you believe that if we organise the people and we build the piers and we get the factories in and we build a school and we teach them how to write and we teach them how to read and we do all this kind of thing for them, then we're all going to be happy and all boats are going to rise and every boat is going to turn into a yacht and everything else. Okay, we're going to progress and eventually we're all rich. That's the capitalist myth. Okay, the capitalist myth, which we all talk. It's what's called. I think the version of it today is pull on the green jersey. Okay, you know, if we all just work together, we're all going to get rich. Okay, that's the myth that Father Mauclair represents as a conscious district board and so on. And at the beginning, Skerrett, of course, falls for that myth himself. Okay, but is very quickly turned off that because Skerrett sees, as O'Flaherty saw himself in his own life in Arran, that what actually happens is a small few gombeens get rich, okay, and the rest of you can go to hell. Okay, familiar story? Yeah, okay. So then again, the prescience of O'Flaherty is very, very important in that mark. So that's one myth the myth of Christianity, I would argue, okay, and the myth of liberal progressive capitalism both collapsed, to an almost unrescuable extent, philosophically and in literature, okay, at least, okay, in the First World War, okay. So at the end of all that preaching, at the end of all that Christianity, at the end of all that progress, at the end of all those speeches by Lloyd George and everybody else about where we were going to go and how we were going to be happy and rich, we ended up shooting each other, bombing each other, raping each other, and everything else. Okay, and O'Flaherty, who, if anyone was an allegorical man or a symbolic man in the sense that he lived through all of this collapse himself. Okay, he lived through all of this collapse himself. He was in the trenches of World War I. He witnessed the collapse of these mythologies, these sustaining ideologies, okay? And again, he was part of a general literary and philosophical movement which tried in the 1920s, and something that O'Flaherty would have been very aware of, led to try to, God almighty, what's happening? Everything we believed in is dead. Everything we believed in is dead. There's no hope, okay? And you see that happening in the 20s and 30s in things like German expressionist art, okay? And if I was to argue for another label for Skerrett and a lot of O'Flaherty's writing, I would call him a literary expressionist, okay? Because his emotions color the expression of the work in the same way that emotion colors the expression of people like Otto Dix and George Grosz, great expressionist painters and so on, in Germany in particular in the 20s and 30s. He would have been aware of all that. Okay. What other myths collapsed? Of course, Seosamh spoke yesterday about being an atheist. One thing he doesn't believe in God. One thing I don't believe in is atheists. Okay, and in fairness, any man who will talk to a rock for half an hour cannot be described as an atheist. He mightn't have been a Catholic, but he certainly wasn't an atheist. In fairness to him, right? Atheism is a hard one to pull off, I think. In reality, we don't like people talk about the collapse of religion in Ireland. That's not what happened in Ireland. There's been a collapse of institutional Catholicism. That's what's happened. There's been a collapse of religious belief. There's been a collapse of, people believe in all sorts of things now. There's syncretic, personal, individual versions of belief are happening all over. We've a little bit of Buddhism, we've a little bit of this, that, and the other thing, okay? And Skerrett, or Flaherty and Skerrett are confused syncretists, okay? All of their beliefs have collapsed, but they can't live without belief, okay? They can't live without belief. Lovely, that's nice.
I'll free you.
Cheers. Keep going, I was going to say. But, very good. Skerritt's going around, and 1 year he believes in one thing, okay? He believes in the Irish language. Or he doesn't believe in the Irish language, he believes in the English language. Next thing he believes in the Irish language. 1 year he believes in a sort of a Russellian version of pacifism and hippieism and, don't have any money and anarchism and all that stuff. And there's a character in the book called Melia, who I believe is George Russell, in disguise, if you like, and who is really exposed as a complete hypocrite, okay? He runs off with the landlord's daughter, okay? Fabulous, great thing to do, I think. But it certainly contradicted his philosophy, if you like, okay? So another critique is aimed at the, what you might call the pacifistic. George Orwell had a terrible phrase for him as well. I can't think of it. The vegan kind. You know what I mean? In the movement, if you like. They don't really mean it in the end. And so there you go. Not like to insult anybody there, but that's what he thought. Mightn't be what I think. Okay. But what was the great myth? We all know what the great myth was, don't we? That replaced the belief in Christianity. The belief in liberal progress, the belief in capitalist civilization. We all know what the great myth is. Some of us are still followers to one degree or another, maybe critical followers at this stage of the great myth, but that great myth is socialism. Okay? And there was a massive explosion, if you like. Socialism spread across Europe like a fire. Okay? Like a fire that people thought was not going to go out until the whole world was glowing with it. Okay? There was the Marxism of the 1914 to 1930-32, or even to 1956, if we want to push it, okay, period, was not a Marxism that broke the idea that things might go wrong, okay? If things did go wrong, you just pretended they weren't actually going wrong, okay? And that was a big problem, as we all recognise now, I think, in the communist movement in general, okay? And O'Flaherty, again, being very prescient, okay, saw that actually things had started to go wrong, okay? He was a person who, like his brother, had a passionate commitment, a passionate belief to the extent of putting his life in danger, okay, and rather absurdly, I think, but it's a beautiful absurdity. We have a lot of beautiful absurdity in the history of the socialist movement. This is one of the most beautiful ones, is he declared the Irish Soviet Republic in the Rotunda, okay, which, by the way, I think we should do again, okay, for the crack to raise some, raise some attention for O'Flaherty, but we should do it in the private Beacon Hospital this time, and hang a couple of consultants, okay, but don't quote me on that, but do, so. When I talk about O'Flaherty as a symbolic man, he's symbolic in that sense, is that he tried it all, but none of it worked. Okay? So at the end of the day, politics isn't working, right? Religion isn't working. O'Flaherty is a very religious person, I think. Okay? Certainly in his literature. Okay? Pacifism wasn't working. Okay? Beating the living daylights out of the peasants wasn't working, right? Telling them to give up money and just start swapping cows for favours, go back to a barter economy, that wasn't working, okay? What was left? What's left when all of those dreams sort of fall in the cascading way that they fell in Europe between, say, the great hope of the 1917 revolution, still the greatest event in world history, rivaled perhaps by the French Revolution and the Arab Spring at this stage, but still the greatest revolution, the greatest event in world history, the 1917 Russian Revolution, which very quickly started to go wrong, okay, after the failure of the German Revolution to spread the revolution, Okay, that's history. Okay. Now, what happens to an isolated artistic intellectual? Okay, a person who wasn't very sociable. Okay, on occasion, a person who suffered from what they call, which I think is much better than attention deficit disorder or opposition defiance disorder and all these new pharmaceutical company labels that the Department of Education is promoting on behalf of Big Pharma. Well, he suffered from a thing with a Latin name, according to the doctor, called melancholia acuta. Okay? So in other words, he was a very sad man on occasion and very cranky as well. And we know when we're sad and cranky, we don't like to go out. And if we do go out, we get into trouble. Isn't that right? Yeah, you know that's the story, isn't it? So when you're like that and you have a big library and a big brain, what do you turn to? What do you turn to? What do you do? You don't really believe in the Bible anymore, but you've one thing left. The counter-narrative in the history of ideas. Philosophical literature, okay? The type of books, the type of literature which has always put the idea out there that maybe it's all nonsense. Maybe it all means nothing. Maybe all the struggle is for absolutely nothing, okay? And certainly Flaherty, and certainly some of the greatest writers of the last 200 years, that has been their position, their ultimate position, okay? And the writers that Flaherty was in love with, such as Dostoevsky, kind of a parallel man, if you like, to O'Flaherty in many ways. His life story is quite similar, as it happens to O'Flaherty's. He turned to Knut Hamsun, the author of Hunger, another fascist, as it happens, okay, but a great writer who got to the core of this feeling in European civilization that we are absolutely worthless and all we are doing is destroying the world, right? And we would be better off dead. And human beings would be better off having never existed. Now, that's a frightening philosophy, okay? But it's a very, very strongly attractive one to intellectuals who have lost hope in everything else, okay? And that's what happened to Dostoevsky. He lost hope. Dostoevsky was a romantic revolutionary as well. Then he went to prison. He got beaten out of him, basically, okay? Another writer, which I think which we can read back into influence on Skerrett to an extent, but on O'Flaherty overall certainly is Semine, okay? Another fascist, but another great writer, and whose book Journey to the End of the Night is one of the great novels of the century, and is certainly about that feeling after the First World War that civilization is a mistake, okay? So embedded also in Skerrett is this critique of civilization itself, okay? That human civilization is a mistake, okay? It's a bad mistake. All it leads to is suffering, lies, madness, despair, and exploitation, okay? And that is the line of nihilistic literature, existentialist literature, coming from Desailly through Dostoevsky, through Hamsun, onto O'Flaherty, and in the afterwar period, people like Camus and Sartre to an extent, and so on. Okay, I want to read a couple of extracts from O'Flaherty's letters and things like that to give you an idea of how he journeyed, and I think this is important. O'Flaherty never settled on any particular ideology for very long. He passionately believed in something for 5 minutes. That's a very artistic way to be, by the way. Okay? I identify with that. Okay. Here is O'Flaherty on his escape from being a priest. Okay, and of course he became an anti-cleric after that. Of course, a lot of people who were in seminaries become anti-clerical as it happens. Ask Joe Higgins. Okay, now this, it's true, he was a priest, right? This was a far greater blow to my relatives than my refusal to become a priest. This is him joining the British Army. And it was the event in my life most responsible for the outcast position in which I now find myself. May the devil be praised. No matter how we may curse the war, my generation was fortunate in being given this wonderful lesson in the defects of the European system of civilization. Had it not been for my participation in the war, I might still be a petty Irish nationalist with a carped outlook on life, one of those snivelling patriots who would prefer an Irish dunghill to an English flower garden in full bloom. Be that as I may, when I came home from the war in 1918, I was regarded as a pariah and a fool and a renegade. Okay? Thank God for the British Army, by the way, because the British Army trained Tom Barry as well. Okay, that's the thing that people forgot. It's a good idea to join the British Army if you wanted to learn how to beat them, right? Okay, so what else is Skerrett? What else is he but a pariah, a fool, and a renegade? Okay, I think that's basically the autobiographical allegory of Skerrett as well, obviously. By the way, Skerrett, or O'Flaherty's father, is very present in the figure of Skerrett, particularly towards the end of the novel where he loses his mind completely, as apparently, at least O'Flaherty says, or maybe exaggerates, happened to his own dad, you know. So we see there, the other thing about O'Flaherty, which I really like about him, is, and I kind of like this as well myself sometimes when I write, he's like a fella that's mad drunk and decides to beat up everybody at once, right? He's not going to attack just one crowd, he'll attack them all at once and make as many enemies as he possibly can in his couple of sentences. So here he attacks his own crowd in the Aran Islands, right? Aren't they a bunch of fools, right? They didn't get him, they thought he was really good. He attacks the whole European civilization, he attacks Irish patriots and everything else. They're all in there, they're all useless. I know though, he says. And then he said to Flaherty, what do you know? And actually, he knows nothing. Okay? And that is the Socratic element of Skerrett. The only thing I know is I know nothing. At the end, we can't say that Skerrett teaches us anything, except that life is very confusing and difficult to figure out, right? And there's a huge honesty to that, which I think the left overall would have benefited from taking on in 1930, instead of pretending that what was happening in Russia was somehow a good thing. Okay? It would have been better to say we don't know what's happening and we can't figure it out, okay, than to say we do know what's happening. And anyone who says we don't know what's happening, shoot them. Okay? Because that's what happened. Okay? That's what happened. So doubt is better than certainty. Okay? The great German poet, a Jewish German, Erich Fried, who referred to himself as a Palestinian and a supporter of the Palestinian cause in the 1970s. He wrote a little poem. He's a great poet. There's a book called 100 Poems Without a Country. This poem is, do not doubt those who say they have fears, but be afraid of those who say they have no doubts. Okay? And if there is any great intellectual legacy that we have from O'Flaherty, and it's hugely important to us, okay, is that we have to doubt, we have to argue. Of course we have to struggle. We have to fight, and we have to fight to win, and all of those type of things, but we also have to doubt, and we have to have a critical conversation about all of these things so it doesn't go so badly wrong again. Okay, I just want to read a couple of more extracts, and then I think I'll give up then, if you don't mind. But O'Flaherty is so wonderful writer himself that, you know, it's really a pity not to read as much as we can. Okay, here is a letter from O'Flaherty to Garnet, George, or what was his first name? Edward. Yeah, who was his kind of mentor and minded him a bit in fairness. Okay, the human race has not advanced from savagery to culture on the feeble crutches of philosophy. What epics have been written about the disputations of scholars? Did Homer write of philosophy, or of the hunting of wild boars and the savage wars waged around stone-walled cities? Important question. Did Shakespeare live in the days of 20% oil stocks and the loathsome mouthings of Ramsay MacDonald's at Geneva about leagues of nations that are based on fraud, corruption, and the usury of slim-fingered, cultured bankers? Familiar story? Okay. Did he not live in the days when piratical adventurers carried the standards of Britain across the oceans and the continents? Did he not live in the days when his race was emerging with bloodshot eyes, lean, hungry, virile, savage, from the savagery of feudalism into the struggle for empire? In Ireland, to my mind, we have reached that point in the progress of our race, the point which marks the appearance of Shakespeare in English literature. Now, in brackets, that's me, he's saying, right? You know, I love writers. We all think like that, okay? We wouldn't be any good if we didn't, okay? Let us not be ashamed that gunshots are heard on our streets. Let us rather be glad. For force is, after all, the opposite of sluggishness. It is an intensity of movement, of motion, and motion is the opposite of death. India is cultured. It is an age-long culture. It is a culture of sweet, beautiful words and of slim fingers, slim, long, aristocratic fingers that are effete and on their deathbed. It is a ghostly culture. The culture of dead men walking the earth, crying out in a wilderness peopled with ghosts. Beauty and peace, sweet, melancholy peace. But ours is the wild tumult of the unchained storm. The tumult of the army on the march, clashing its cymbals, rioting with excess of energy. Need we be ashamed of it? No, I slightly suspect he had a couple of glasses of wine before he put that down, because again, it's drink talking, isn't it, in fairness? At a very high level, it is drink talking. I'm going to kill the whole lot of you, that kind of thing, right? And you do get that sense from O'Flaherty. Now, he worships violence there, and a couple of years later, or 6 months later, he's giving out about a terrible thing altogether, okay? So he switches and he switches and he switches. So what's important about O'Flaherty is that he symbolises, and Skerrett symbolises, the confusion, the vacillation, and the despair of the progressive European intelligentsia following the failure of all the myths. Okay? They didn't know what to do. And they went in two ways. They went into nihilism, they went in three ways. They found ways to build small revolutionary groups as well. We won't forget that. But the major current was bifurcated into blind faith in Stalinism, okay, and and the other one was nihilism, belief in nothing. Belief in nothing leads to drink, drugs, suicide, and so on and so forth. Decadence, in other words. Okay, we still have all of those things today. Okay, and that's why O'Flaherty is important, because one thing that we can say about the progressive intelligentsia today, even though we're back on our feet, and we're fighting again, okay, we had 80,000 on the streets again yesterday, fabulous, okay, even though we're back on the feet, we don't have, thank God, a dominant ideology, okay, but we do need to have ideas, okay, we do need to have them, and I think the resurrection of O'Flaherty will be an important part of having that discussion, okay. I'll finish at that. There's plenty more we can say. You can talk about O'Flaherty for weeks and weeks and weeks, but I could anyway, okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to sit down and, me and Seosamh would be delighted to banter there.